military activity and improvement of the humanitarian situation in the 4 de-escalation zones. Astana reaffirms its readiness to further the political process to achieve peace and stability in Syria. I want to underline that the Astana platform complements the Geneva platform and is not intended to replace it. In searching for an exit strategy, a regional approach should be considered as a very effective method in mitigating the situation and preventing further deterioration. Kazakhstan therefore calls on all Middle East and Gulf states to join the guarantor countries in ensuring that the ceasefire regime is respected and observed by all parties. In order to witness further progress, it is important to continue supporting the objectives and gains of the Astana and Geneva negotiations and of the 3 guarantors. The humanitarian situation is grave and deserves our merit. Kazakhstan highly appreciates the activities of humanitarian personnel of the UN in Syria, namely the Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, the World Health Organization, and the Syrian Arab Red Crescent Society. We call on the Syrian government and neighboring countries not impede the access of humanitarian assistance to refugee camps, and we urge Syria to open humanitarian corridors to the besieged areas. Following a comprehensive review by the United Nations, we were pleased to learn that Deir ez-Zor and 93,500 people in the city are being removed from the list of those besieged. 419,920 people still remain besieged in 10 locations across Syria. We encouraged about the UN humanitarian personnel as OCHA, SARC, and the World Food Programme's delivery of humanitarian aid to Deir ez-Zor via land for the first time since earlier this month. For the safe withdrawal of civilians from the war zones and protection of civilians should be the primary requisites in all operations. We support the USG Mark Lowcock visit to Syria in near future to see the situation on the ground for himself. The parties to the conflict and the countries supporting them should agree on the release of detainees, hostages, the transfer of the dead, the exchange of information on missing persons. Finally, Mr. President, the Security Council must fulfill its statutory duties by taking more effective and collaborative measures to resolve the Syrian crisis as soon as possible. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Kazakhstan for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
Thank you, Mr. President. Allow me, in the beginning, Mr. President, to congratulate you for assuming presidency of the Security Council for this month. I also congratulate you on your success in leading the deliberations of the Council. Mr. President, by just listening to some of the briefings from some of our colleagues just now, by just comparing these briefings or these statements, such a comparison indicates that some know what they're talking about and what's happening in Syria by virtue of being on the ground and their political involvement in following the developments and the situation in Syria, while some others who have spoken are not on the ground and do not know what's happening in Syria, and are primarily basing their statements on media fabrications and intelligence information that present an image that what's happening in Syria is not related to counterterrorism, and that there's a humanitarian crisis caused solely by the Syrian government. This comparison is very important as I begin to speak, so that some colleagues become aware that 7 years into the terrorist war imposed against my country, it is now time to seize all one-upmanship and all delusive tactics. Mr. President, I have very carefully listened to the briefing by the new Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Mr. Mark Lowcock, and I wish him all the success in implementing his noble mission as the head of OCHA. I assure him here that we are most ready to cooperate with any sincere effort to address the humanitarian situation in my country, so long as the purpose is assisting the Syrian people without seeking to exploit the Syrian people's pain for interventionist agendas. The Syrian government, since the beginning of the terrorist war against my country, has continued to cooperate with the United Nations and its different agencies to deliver humanitarian assistance to the people who need them, based on the governing principles of humanitarian work, particularly General Assembly Resolution 182/46, at the head of which is the respect for Syrian sovereignty, which has been upheld by all Security Council resolutions on Syria. The issue of sovereignty is extremely important, dear colleagues, because some forget when they speak the issue of sovereignty. And in all friendliness and love, I tell our colleague, Mr. Mark Lowcock, that he has committed this mistake today when, in his statement, he has not mentioned at all cooperation with the Syrian government, as if the OCHA is cooperating with ghosts in Syria and not a government. Mr. President, we believe it is now time, after the Secretary General Report number 43 on the humanitarian situation in Syria, to move from a state of denial to recognition that the root cause of this crisis in my country is the emergence and proliferation of armed terrorist groups, at the forefront of which is Daesh and al-Nusra and their affiliated groups. And the summoning of tens of thousands of foreign terrorist fighters and their spread in all neighborhoods and villages and taking civilians there as humanitarian shields and promoting barbarian ideologies. This has been affirmed by the report of the Analytical Support and Sanctions Monitoring Team established pursuant to Resolution 1526, and that has been issued as document S/2015/358. Also, some states have imposed, in blatant violation of international law, unilateral arbitrary economic measures against the Syrian people, which has led to hardship of life and exacerbation of their suffering in all areas: economic, social, humanitarian, and health related. My colleague, the ambassador of the United States, has just said that her government has allocated $160 million to spend on Syrian refugees in neighboring countries. Would it not have been better that these amounts be used to return the refugees to their home nation, Syria, to rebuild schools and hospitals and roads, instead of pressing to keep them outside Syrian territory? Mr. President, we have met a few days ago with Mr. Lowcock, and we conveyed to him very clearly the concerns of the Syrian government and its observations on the performance of OCHA during the recent period, based on our hopes to build a transparent and professional relationship and objective relationship that leads to achieving our objectives and your objectives, which are to assist the Syrian people in fulfilling their needs and to provide assistance to everyone who needs it, and to rehabilitate infrastructure so that refugees and displaced persons can return to their homes after stability is restored by the efforts of Syria and allied countries. The relationship that we hope to achieve with the United Nations and its humanitarian agencies are, one, this relationship is first a legal relationship that respects the governing principles of humanitarian work. Second, it's an ethical relationship based on the non-politicization of the humanitarian situation, and not to exploit it as a means to exert pressure on the Syrian government. Third, a relationship of partnership and cooperation where we recognize the efforts of the Syrian government to deliver assistance and the barriers that obstruct the delivery of assistance. A realistic relationship that recognizes that the real reason behind Syrian suffering is international terrorism, in addition to the unilateral, arbitrary economic measures imposed by the United States and the European Union and other countries against the Syrian people. Fifth, a credible relationship that recognizes that illegal actions of the international coalition are increasing the suffering of Syrians through killing thousands of civilians and destroying infrastructure. A credible relationship that recognizes that suspicious sources cannot be relied upon, or sources related to terrorist organizations in assessing the situation in Syria. Fifth, a relationship that rejects treating Syrian pain as a commodity, that recognizes that donor conferences are just for show, and that refuse the exploitation of donor countries this humanitarian situation. The proportion of delivering assistance pledges has not increased to over 33%. A relationship that also denounces the connection of Syria's political work with the financing of the humanitarian response. Mr. President, American aircrafts have struck a school for disabled students, and I suddenly now find accusation against Syrian Air Force that we have attacked the school in the same area. This relationship I am speaking of, Mr. President, must not only aim to lift the suffering, or it must be based on trust and partnership and cooperation and dialogue and professionalism and credibility, and not on the basis of imposing conditions that violate Syrian sovereignty. Mr. President, the Syrian government has not spared effort since the beginning of what we call the crisis to be involved in any sincere effort to improve access of humanitarian assistance. By example, my country has recently accepted and approved the resident coordinator's proposal to establish a mechanism that includes the Syrian government and the Russian Federation and the United Nations to promote coordination between the active parties in the humanitarian scene in Syria as part of the humanitarian response plan and as per the joint convoys plan, and also to review and implement measures to deliver assistance to the de-escalated zones. And this mechanism has held its first meeting in Damascus on the 19th of September. The Syrian government stresses the importance that humanitarian assistance not be limited to de-escalated zone, to destabilized zones. They must also reach areas liberated by the Syrian Arab Army and its allied forces, particularly in Deir ez-Zor and eastern Aleppo and other places. We appreciate here very much the important assistance provided by the government of the Russian Federation and the Islamic Republic of Iran. Some want to fight Iran in Syria and to fight our allied forces allied to us in Syria. This is defaming, and it violates international law and the UN Charter. Mr. President, I've also listened to the briefing by the Special Envoy, Mr. Stefan de Mistura, and I would like to say here that the Deputy Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister has affirmed days ago before the General Assembly that the policy of the Syrian state has been based since the beginning of the terrorist war against us on two pillars. They are counterterrorism and working diligently and consistently to achieve a political solution that ends the bloodshed and restores stability, and to continue the national reconciliations that have proven successful and that have allowed thousands of displaced persons and refugees to return to their homes, and that have contributed largely to improving the living conditions of large numbers of Syrians who have suffered too much from terrorist crimes. The Syrian government has demonstrated seriousness and commitment to the two processes of Astana and Geneva, and we have attended 7 rounds in Astana and 7 in Geneva. And some still say that the Syrian government is not serious about the political process. So what have we been doing for 7 rounds in Astana and 7 rounds in Geneva? My country views positively the Astana process and the resulting identification of de-escalated zones, hoping that we will reach a real end of all fighting and separate the terrorist organizations such as Daesh and Nusra and others from the other groups that have agreed to join the Astana process. What is wrong about this, I say here? What is wrong? Isn't this compatible with the Security Council resolutions? In the same vein, my government renews its commitment to the Geneva process and seeks to advance it. And the Syrian delegation has joined all rounds of the Geneva negotiations seriously and responsibly. And lately, we have had a very useful round with the Special Envoy and his team, where we have focused on 2 topics: combating terrorism and meetings of the experts of constitutional law. In conclusion, Mr. President, my government reiterates it will continue to combat international terrorism on all the territory of the Syrian Arab Republic. I repeat, all the territory of the Syrian Arab Republic. And we stress our fixed position that the solution to this crisis in Syria is a political solution, inter-Syrian, based on inter-Syrian dialogue with Syrian leadership, without external intervention and without conditions. Thank you, Mr. President.
The Arab Republic for his statement. The representative of the United States has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give her the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wanted to respond to a couple of things that I think were said that I think is important that we set the record straight. On Russia's assertion that we should see an end to the cross-border assistance due to gains made in access would be false. Mr. Lowcock just briefed that the UN was only able to reach 280,500 people last month with interagency convoys out of 1.3 million people requested. That's only 21%. Meanwhile, the UN reaches more than 1 million people each month cross-border. These are 1 million people who would be left with nothing if we ceased cross-border aid. In addition, Syrian regime continues to remove medical items from convoys and artificially reduces the beneficiary numbers. These actions are not demonstrations of goodwill from the government, and they're not a government we can trust. Now is not the time to reduce our tools to reach people in need. Syrians have suffered for nearly 7 years. In short, cross-border assistance must continue in order to save millions of people from death and destruction. I will also say that so many of us want to see an end to the Syrian crisis. We all have watched too many people suffer. We've all met in the Security Council too many times to discuss the situation. But I would like to explain to our Syrian counterpart that the refugees didn't leave Syria just because of terrorists. I went there and spoke to the ones in Jordan. I spoke to the refugees in Turkey. And all of them, whether they were in a camp or not in a camp, said their bigger fear was the regime. The reason they left Syria was out of fear for terrorism, but also out of fear of their very own government. And so you were talking about aid, and it was $697 million that is going to host countries, but we're giving those to host countries because we know they take care of their people, and we've seen proof that they take care of their people. We would like to give that money to Syria. We would like to give that money to their government if we can see proof that they are taking care of their own people. And so trust has to be earned. Trust has to be taken in based on good faith and goodwill. We haven't seen that. We're not giving up on seeing that. But there is no way that you can come to this council and talk about the fact that anyone's doing anything politically in this situation, because the truth of the matter is the only political thing we all want is for Syrians to be able to go home and live under a government that takes care of their own people. So give us proof. Give us proof that you're doing good by your people. Give us proof that Syrians are better for being back in Syria and not in Turkey and Jordan, because right now they're being better taken care of in Jordan and Turkey than they've ever been in Syria. And they deserve to go home, and they deserve to feel safe, and they deserve to be in a place where the government takes care of them. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for his statement. The representative of the Russian Federation has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give him the floor.
Благодарю вас, господин.
Yes, thank you, sir. I do not intend to engage in any polemicism, but I would like to note that we need to get to the bottom of the statistics. We need to look at the statistics and the figures, including the statistics as regards the number of people in Syria who have access to humanitarian assistance, people who've received assistance from the United Nations. I think that this is one of the challenges which the new Undersecretary General will have to deal with. I remember very well last time we discussed the matter of Syria, including humanitarian access. We discussed this some time ago, and this was in the consultations room with a representative of OCHA who provided us with compelling data as to the number of people receiving humanitarian assistance. Thanks to assistance provided by the government of the Syrian Arab Republic, and not hundreds of thousands of people. We're talking, unless I'm mistaken, 5 million people received assistance thanks to OCHA cooperation with the government of Syria. I do not wish to dispute the figures or engage in a dispute about the figures, but I'd like us to get to the bottom of the figures. And I would like to ask that Mr. Lokak address this matter. Let's tune our watches or harmonize our watches, so to speak, on this matter. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement. The representative of the Syrian Arab Republic has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give him the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I apologize for requesting the floor once again. Mr. President, WikiLeaks documents, the scandal of WikiLeaks, has revealed the intentions of the United States government to overthrow the regime in my country since 2006. WikiLeaks documents have been printed in the US, and the book is available on Amazon. Whoever wants to acquire the book, it's available. Secret telegraphs between the embassy and the American ambassador in Damascus. There was a plot to overthrow the regime in my country. That was the first point. Second, the memoirs of Hillary Clinton, where she confessed that the American administration was the one that created Daesh and al-Nusra and al-Qaeda, etc. Tens of books that were written inside the US and in Europe, all that have addressed the using terrorism as manipulation, particularly to undermine governments in our Arab and Middle Eastern region. Third, does anyone forget what has happened in Iraq? Can we forget the scandal of the occupation of Iraq and what it led to? And all the resulting catastrophes in our area and in Iraq? Who has called upon and permitted the coalition forces to enter my country, and what are they doing over on our territory in Syria? Is there any justification for this? How can my country's sovereignty be militarily violated in many areas in a blatant and extreme violation of international law? What are American forces doing in our land, and who called upon them to come? Fifth, why did the United States and the Pentagon establish the operations room in Amman? Was it not to train terrorists and send them across the border to my country? Number 6. Have we forgotten that the former U.S. administration has spent $500 million to train 39 terrorists only? $500 million to train 39 terrorists to liberate Syria from its regime. The end was that these 39 terrorists joined Daesh using with their American weapons. Number 7, who attacked Thirda Mountain, the Syrian army at Thirda Mountain in Deir ez-Zur on the 17th of July, September, a year ago? Was it not American aviation, American Air Force that attacked Deir ez-Zur and the Syrian army there, which was protecting 300,000 Daesh members? What was the result? That the American attack there allowed Daesh to attack Deir ez-Zur for an entire year. And the situation has repeated recently. On the 21st of September, this month, the Syrian Defense Ministry and the Russian Defense Ministry have announced that Deir ez-Zur will be liberated from Daesh within 1 week. And our army was at the limit of the Deir ez-Zur, and we have eliminated 850 members of Daesh in Deir ez-Zur. And the terrorists withdrew, and the Syrian army regained control of Deir ez-Zur and areas around Deir ez-Zur. Imagine, ladies and gentlemen, what happened next. The international coalition led by the United States ceased its operations in al-Raqqa, which is the stronghold of Daesh, and advanced the Free Syrian Army, as it's called, to Deir ez-Zor, which our army was liberating. The coalition seized operations in Raqqa and pushed the Syrian Democratic Forces, as they are called, in Deir ez-Zor, as though the Americans are racing the Syrian army to reach Deir ez-Zor instead of fighting Daesh in Raqqa. There were aerial images captured by our allies and friends, the Russians, that reveal relations of that reveal American troops and ISIL, Daesh forces exchanging locations without fighting. What I want to say after this intervention is that American conduct, American, European conduct now, and their attitude towards what's taking place in my country goes against all resolutions that you have adopted since this beginning of the crisis in Syria. All relevant resolutions on Syria and counterterrorism have been violated. The United States government must become aware and know that we are a sovereign state, just like the United States itself. We do not claim a desire to fight the United States, but we want the United States to change its erroneous policies towards my country. What benefit is it for us as a Syrian people that millions of us remain outside the country? My colleague said that the Syrians have fled the practices of the Syrian government, and I now say before you all that the Syrian government wants the host countries to return the refugees to our country. And for millions of Syrians to return with dignity, we must lift the unilateral sanctions so that these millions find opportunities and a dignified life, instead of keeping them in neighboring states. This is the meaning of what we always say, that the Syrian government is being blackmailed through this situation and supporting what is called as a moderate opposition that is genetically modified, as we were saying with Mr. de Mastura. It's blatant blackmail. Political solutions are not as such. Political solutions must be based on our assistance as a government, not to work against us as a government, and to exploit the humanitarian situation to apply pressure. Sorry, I have requested the floor again, Mr. President, and thank you.
Representative of the Syrian Arab Republic for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. I now invite Council members to informal consultations to continue our discussion on the subject. The meeting is adjourned.